What if I told you that Lewis Hamilton's car had such a serious defect that not even Ferrari had noticed? What discovered Frédéric Vasseur that completely changed the team's course? What few knew was that Frédéric Vasseur, with his silent but methodical style, had already activated internal investigation. Ferrari's director not only listened to what Hamilton said in front of the cameras. I read between the lines. He analyzed growing frustration in his radio communications, body language after getting out of the car, and above all, the anomalies recorded in telemetry. While the headlines focused on the lack of rhythm of the British, Vasseur saw in each complaint a possible track, a fragment of really hidden among frustration. And that breakdown came after the Grand Prix of Spain. It was there that Hamilton, visibly counterpart, described his car as inconducible, a word that in the mouth of any other pilot could sound exaggeration, but that coming from someone with his experience and capacity for technical analysis was an alarm signal. It was at that moment when Vasseur gave the order to go to the bottom of the matter, to disassemble piece by piece the SF-25 and discover if, as he sensed, the problem was more serious than anyone wanted to admit. What came after not only changed the season, but revealed how fine is the margin between glory and the failure in the elite of motoring. During the days after the Grand Prix of Spain, Ferrari's technical team operated in forensic mode. Frédéric Vasseur, aware that the credibility of the entire structure was at stake, decided to assume a radically technical approach without concessions. What had begun as a routine collection of post-carrier data quickly transformed into a high-priority investigation. Under their orders, gigabytes of telemetry data were analyzed, thermal images of onboard cameras, vibration records of chassis and aerodynamic behavior maps generated by CFD simulations. Nothing was out of scrutiny. Each session in which Hamilton had reported instability was reviewed to the millimeter. What they were looking for was not a superficial failure, but a structural pattern hidden under layers of technical noise. The first major indication appeared in the aerodynamic load data. A progressive and sustained loss of downforce was detected specifically in the high-speed circuit sections such as Maranello, where rapid curves force a perfect balancing of the car. The most alarming was not the magnitude of the loss itself, but its erratic behavior. Sometimes it happened in the second round of the stint, other times in the fourth. At certain times it was manifested only in the right curve, and in others in a generalized way. This variability led to rule out setup failures or pilot errors, and forced the team to look towards something deeper, the structure of the car. Vasseur instructed engineers to review the elements of suspension, direction and gearbox in search of an out-of-margin tolerance. It was then that they found the first specific indication. Hamilton's SF-25 had an abnormal response of the front axle when entering high lateral energy curves. In simple words, the car did not turn with the expected predictability. The direction obeyed with delay, and in some cases the front train lost adherence in an abrupt way. This behavior went beyond a tire problem or a poorly configured spoiler. It was the symptom of a structural interference that compromised the distribution of loads at the chassis level. But the most devastating findings soon arrived. In the Maranello testing bank, they replicated exact charging conditions that Hamilton had faced in the circuit, and there, in that controlled environment, an anomalous flexion was exposed in the gearbox housing. The unions between the rear suspension and the main frame yielded minimally under extreme loads, generating a specific loss of stiffness that translated into the instability of the car. It was an almost imperceptible defect, but serious enough to decompose the general behavior of the car just at times where the pilot needed it more. Even more disconcerting was to discover that this phenomenon was not reproduced in the car of Charles Leclerc. The stiffness measurements of SF-25 number 16 were within the optimal margins. This led to an even more disturbing conclusion. The problem was not the general design of the car, but of the specific Hamilton unit. Manufacturing tolerances had been wide enough for two apparently identical cars to react radically differently on the track. Vasseur then ordered an exhaustive review of the assembly chain. Structural components, metal alloys, welding points were verified, and even X-ray tests were subjected to detect microfractures or internal asymmetries. The objective was to identify if there was a systemic failure in production or if they were facing an isolated anomaly. Although it did not officially communicate, several internal sources confirmed that several components of the Hamilton car were discreetly withdrew to be replaced by versions with stricter tolerances, which implied a partial redesign under pressure. In this context, Vasseur's work transcended the role of sports director to become that of a technical auditor. He did not limit himself to supervise. He directly interrogated engineers, crossed data between departments and challenged pre-established hypotheses. His decision to investigate thoroughly, even when everything pointed to a simple crisis of adaptation of Hamilton, became an act of technical leadership that probably saved the team's season. Because what was at stake was not only the performance of a pilot, but the reputation of an entire team and the confidence in its engineering process. The implications of the discovery made by Frédéric Vasseur were not limited to a specific correction of the Lewis Hamilton car. They became a complete redefinition of Ferrari's technical approach for the rest of the season. For the first time in a long time, the team openly recognized that the problem was not of general philosophy of the car, but of technical execution. This distinction is crucial. It meant that the SF25 in theory could be a competitive car, but that in practice, a series of micro-errors in manufacturing and in assembly were silently condemning it from within. As a result, Vasseur launched an action plan on 3 simultaneous fronts. The first was a complete internal audit of quality control processes. Each unit manufactured since the beginning of the season was subjected to a rigorous technical analysis to identify any deviation from the original specifications. This included from 3D scan analysis to fatigue tests in dynamic banks. The second front was the reorganization of the feedback structure between pilot and engineers. New analysis protocols were implemented that gave greater weight to the subjective perceptions of the pilot, especially in areas where telemetry was not conclusive. This decision raised the value of Hamilton's technical trial within the team, something that he had discreetly claimed since his final years in Mercedes. The third front was more strategic, the redefinition of the update calendar. Ferrari altered its original program to prioritize components that could stabilize the structural platform of the SF25. Some aerodynamic improvements planned for the Canada GP were postponed to give way to new generation pieces in the rear transmission and suspension zone. This decision was risky because it meant slowing progress in visible areas in favor of correcting invisible but fundamental failures. However, within the team it was assumed as a critical investment in competitive reliability. In the championship, this technical turn allowed Ferrari not only to recover competitiveness, but also position itself as a legitimate contestant against McLaren and Red Bull. Internal simulations began to show that, with the corrections implemented, the SF25 could be the most balanced car in mixed circuits, just where several large key awards would be defined. The expectations were readjusted. The transition with Hamilton was no longer discussed. Now, there was talk of building a winning campaign around its capacity for analysis, its experience and its methodical piloting. What happened with the SF25 and the technical discovery led by Frédéric Vasseur goes far beyond a simple mechanical adjustment. It is the brutal reflection of what it represents competing to the highest level in Formula One modern, an environment where each millimeter, each manufacturing tolerance, each technical decision can define the destination not only of a car, but of a whole season. In such a technologically advanced sport, with margins of difference that are often measured in thousandths of a second, a small deviation in the rigidity of a component can translate into a total loss of competitiveness. And that was exactly the case of Lewis Hamilton's car, an almost invisible defect that was costing races, points and credibility. This scenario exposed the fragility of large teams when they face problems that are not solved with money or reputation. Because Ferrari was not only dealing with a newly arrived pilot and a temperamental car. He was fighting himself, against internal processes that had overlooked critical failures, against a culture that sometimes privileged the protocol on technical intuition, and against a story that demanded immediate results without margin for error. But what this story makes even more powerful is the way in which Vasseur decided to answer. With method, humbly, and above all, with strategic clarity that has rarely seen in Maranello in recent years. Hamilton's resurgence, as he began to hint in China's GP, should not be read only as an improvement in his personal performance. It is the visible manifestation of a much deeper change within the team. It is the proof that, when the correct signals are heard and decisions based on data and rigorous analysis are made, even the heaviest structures can react, correct the course and be competitive again. Ferrari is not just saving a season. He is reconstructing a narrative that for years seemed stagnant in repetitive errors and lost opportunities. And yet, the big question in the air is whether this turn will be enough. Because the championship does not expect. McLaren has already demonstrated his consistency, Red Bull is still a lethal rival in the hands of Verstappen, and Mercedes, with Russell in front, has also given danger signs. In that context, Ferrari needs more than a technical correction. You need continuity, precision, and impeccable execution during each weekend of the calendar. And, perhaps the most difficult, needs to maintain internal harmony between two elite pilots with personal ambitions that will inevitably collide. What Vasseur has done is extraordinary, but it is also only the first step. Because in Formula One, discovering the correct problem is just the beginning. The true test is to sustain the rhythm, to convert that diagnosis into sustainable results, and to demonstrate that this team can not only be great but can do it with a method, with identity, and with the ability to learn from their mistakes. And now the decision is in your hands. Do you think Ferrari and Hamilton can maintain this trend and really fight for the title? Or the weight of the challenges they face will end up returning them to the instability that has hurt them so many times in the last decade?